Welcome to the 50th review on my channel. I'm really pleased to reach that number, and I'm glad it's this film that just happens to have landed in the 50th spot. A classic film like Dracula, and not some dodgy sequel like Blair Witch Book of Shadows that I don't care about. Dracula is an absolute classic. It's Christopher Lee's first time playing the role as well. Dracula to Lee, I mean, he was as synonymous with that character as James Bond was with Sean Connery. Lee played this role 9, 10 times throughout the 50s, 60s and 70s, usually under the Hammer banner, but often via other production companies as well. He was in high demand to play this role, and I definitely read that on at least one of the Dracula sequels, they weren't going to go ahead with the movie unless Lee agreed to return. And you only have to watch this original Dracula, or horror Dracula as it's also known, to see why that would be the case, because he was born to play this villain. I mean, he had this imposing, tall physique about him, and he could also convey these expressions of such contempt and disgust whenever there was a human mortal in front of him that just needed to be fanged into joining him. And yet he could also infuse those looks with just a layer of lustfulness if it was a female victim. I'm not surprised at all that so many of his would-be victims throughout the series struggled to kind of turn on their heels and get away from him when he gave them the glare. I mean, it was quite something. His fighting skills were a little bit hokey, but I don't think that's really a Lee or a Dracula thing. I think that's more of a 50s, 60s filmmaking thing in general. Fights on screen just really weren't that great back then. You don't get to find out anything about the origins of the character in this movie. The film starts with him already established as living in his castle, and it's implied that he's been doing what he does for quite some time. There's no backstory. There were several other Dracula films that came out before Hammer got involved. I've never seen any of those. They all came out in like the 20s, 30s, 40s. I don't know if you find much out about the history of Dracula in those movies. I guess you could go back to the 1897 original novel by Bram Stoker for some information, but I don't know if you would get any. I read the first paragraph on Wikipedia about the plot from that novel once, and it tells us that a character called Harker goes to Castle Dracula and slowly realizes that he's becoming a prisoner of the Count. So that tells me on its own that the 58 film is at least some attempt to adapt the original novel. So maybe you don't get any origins in the novel as well, I don't know. But even if you did find anything out from other forms of media, films, books, it doesn't mean that that would make it canon for the Hammer run of Dracula films. Maybe Hammer just didn't want any backstory or origins, and that's absolutely fine by me, as I've already said. Now, we don't just get a good antagonist in this film, we also get a good protagonist. We've got Peter Cushing as Van Helsing, and he's absolutely brilliant in this role. Cushing and Lee go head to head in this film, and it's brilliant. And Van Helsing, he's such a courageous character. Twice in the movie, he blunders his way into Dracula's castle unarmed, and yet seemingly has this unshakable belief that he can overcome whatever he's going to face up against. He's also extremely smart. There's one scene where he's listening to this dictaphone, absorbing all this information about the various attributes of vampirism, and presumably his cogs are turning in his head about how he can use this to defeat the creature. His elocution skills are impeccable. At one point, he has to sort of get involved with Harker's fiance's family and get them to trust him so he can not only help them, but use them to help him find Dracula. But the way he sort of talks his way into that inner circle is really, really clever. And it's a good thing that he's skilled at that, because if he couldn't do that, then he wouldn't be in position to spot Dracula going down into the cellar towards the end of the film and sort of rumbling him, if you like, about where his secret hiding spot is. So, yeah, on the whole, I love Van Helsing in this movie. He's absolutely terrific. Now, as much as I've waxed lyrical about the characters, story is definitely king in this film. As I've already alluded to, it begins with Van Helsing's colleague Harker trying to pass himself off as a library assistant so he can get close to Dracula and kill him at an opportune moment. He doesn't succeed in this, but it's fun to watch him try. Although I think the best thing about this opening segment is just getting to see Dracula's castle up close and personal. There would often be a different castle or mansion in these films each time, but I don't think any of them looked as good as this one from the original. I mean, from the outside, you can see this cool looking driveway and bridge and the mountains in the distance. Inside there's all this cavernous splendor, and yet the decor looks oddly decadent, as if you could easily imagine a vampire living in this place. This is the only portion of the film, incidentally, where we get to see Dracula speak, and I think that's so that we get an example of how charming and disarming he can be, so that even if we don't hear him speak again, either in this film or future ones, we know that it's not just the glare that reels people in, it's also his charm. He has that in common with Van Helsing, actually. Going back to Harker, it's curious to me how he would be the one out of the two of them, him and Van Helsing, to go on this dangerous mission. I would have thought Van Helsing would have been the more suited to the task. I don't know if it's cleared up in the novel more as to why this is, and this script just doesn't tell us why it's Harker who opens the movie. The only thing I can think of is that possibly Dr. Van Helsing is more well known in the community as a doctor and scientist than Harker is, and possibly it's thought that Dracula would recognise him at interview, but I don't know. As good as this first act is, I still prefer the second act. I just love seeing Van Helsing playing detective and getting embroiled in this whole cat and mouse game with Dracula. A couple of the smaller characters in this section are played by noteworthy actors. The first is Charles Lloyd Pack, who plays Dr. Seward. His son Roger Lloyd Pack played Trigger in the UK TV show Only Fools and Horses. I used to love this show growing up, so it was interesting to me to find out that his dad used to act and was in a film as big as Dracula. Also, in a slightly bigger role, Michael Gough plays the character of Arthur. He was, many decades later, he played Alfred the butler in the all those dodgy Batman films from the 1990s. And for my money, as bad as those films were, still a better Alfred than Michael Caine's Alfred, as much as I love Michael Caine, but I digress. So let's talk about the finale, where Dracula and Van Helsing finally face off. Spoiler alert, Van Helsing wins. They have this really big chase with horses and carriages to Dracula's castle. Van Helsing is quite some distance behind, but there's a great bit of humour in this this stretch of the film, because Dracula just bursts through this toll barrier thing, and this guy comes out looking stunned at what's just happened. So he rebuilds this toll barrier with rope, and I'm guessing it takes him about 10 minutes, but just as he's finished, Van Helsing finally comes through and he just knocks it down again. And this guy's just like, it's really, really funny. And this same character was in a funny scene quite earlier in the movie as well. So he's definitely the comic relief of the film. Once we get to the climatic battle, I'm always nervous when it comes to these endings in these old films to see if they over push things and try and put too many special effects that they're just not very good at doing in a bid to make it more bombastic, if you like. But thankfully, in Dracula, things are kept short and sweet. There's the smallest of fights, and then Van Helsing runs across this table and pulls this curtain down, and Dracula's killed by sunlight. It's a really exciting moment. When I first saw it, and I saw what Van Helsing was going to do, I thought that Dracula was going to grab his legs and they'd have a little battle to see if Van Helsing could reach the curtain or not. But no, they played it straight, and it's a really, really good ending. And I like the special effects when Dracula's melting. It looks really good. So just a couple of things to add before I wrap up. If you need any more praise about how good this film is, don't just take it from me, take it from Time Out magazine, who called this film the 65th best British film of all time when they did some kind of poll, or they just decided this stuff themselves when they did it in 2017. And also Empire magazine, and I don't know what year they did this, but they declared Christopher Lee's Dracula to be the 7th best horror movie character of all time. So high praise indeed. I don't really have any criticisms of the film. It's perfect for a film that came out in 1958. One thing I will say is I've got this 3-disc Blu-ray set for this film. It's a really good release. Lots of features on it, most of which I haven't seen yet. If you put the Blu-ray in, you get a choice of a restoration from 2007 or a restoration from 2012. So I was left thinking, what the hell do I choose? So in the end, I went for the 2012 one, thinking, well, if it was done more recently, it must be better. So I put it in, and it looks great. I've not seen the 2007 one to compare, but the one I watched was absolutely fantastic, really, really crisp looking. But oddly, there's 2 sections of the movie where for about 10 seconds, we lose the crispness, and it goes into this really scratchy, dirty kind of look, as if we're watching how the film would have looked back in 1958. One of these parts is when Dracula's just leaning into to bite Lucy, I think. And then I think the second time it happened might have been when he was melting at the end of the film. I don't know whether this was because they just couldn't clean up these little parts for whatever reason, or maybe they just decided to leave these little snippets in to show you what the film used to look like and how lucky we are to get these really fresh, clean looking versions. I don't know. If it's the latter, fine. I didn't mind them doing that. It was interesting to me to have these brief little clips where we get to see how Dracula used to look. So, you know what? Let's get to the bag of terror and find out what sort of score we have for Dracula. We have 4 bloody axes out of 5. That's an excellent score. I did resist the temptation to give it 5. If I was reviewing this in 1958, maybe I would have given it 5. I might have given it 5 bloody axes if I'd been reviewing it in 1968. But in 2020, with all these 50, 60 years of more advanced films, it's slightly harder for me to give it the maximum masterpiece score. But given how old it is, that is a brilliant score. You should absolutely see this film if you haven't already. We don't have a pin for the horror locations board today because we've already marked Romania's card. But until next time, I will see you. Bye-bye.